Thomas the tank engine was ill. Workmen had tried to make him better, but it was no use. "Edward must take you to the works," said the Fat Controller. Thomas felt very miserable. Then the Fat Controller spoke to Duck. "I want you to help Percy and Toby while Thomas is away." Duck was delighted. He already knew Percy and soon made friends with Toby and Bertie. Terence the tractor gave him a big welcome too. "Take care of Thomas's coaches," he advised. "He's sure to miss them while he's away." Duck was very gentle with the coaches. Annie and Clarabel were impressed. "Such nice manners," they told each other. "It really is a pleasure to go out with you." When Thomas came back, Annie and Clarabel told him how well Duck had managed. Thomas was so pleased to be home that he soon forgot to be jealous. The works had left Thomas's handbrake very stiff. It made his brakes seem as if they were hard on, when in fact they were not. As a result, he and his coaches often overran the platform. Thomas found this most embarrassing. Gradually, his driver and fireman learned to be extra careful. But one day, Thomas's fireman was ill, and a relief man took his place. The fireman had fastened the coupling and joined the driver and station master on the platform to wait for Henry's passengers. The fireman had forgotten all about Thomas's handbrake. Thomas simmered happily. Not long now, he thought, as he saw Henry slowly approaching. But Thomas's brakes were not hard on, and suddenly he felt his wheels begin to move. He tried to stop, but he couldn't without his driver and fireman. He tried to whistle a warning, but he couldn't do that either. The guard, driver, fireman, and passengers were all stranded on the platform. "Stop! Stop!" shrieked Annie and Clarabel. But Thomas, with plenty of steam, kept on going. The alarm went out down the line. "Stop the runaway!" There, ready for action, was Harold the helicopter. The inspector had made a plan, and together they took off into the sky. At last, Thomas was tiring. "I need to stop. I need to stop," he panted wearily. As they neared the next station, Thomas saw Harold land. They entered the platform slowly enough for the inspector to act. Judging his moment, the inspector scrambled into the cab and screwed the brake hard on. At last, Thomas stopped. Both he and the inspector were very relieved. Then they thanked Harold. "Think nothing of it," wailed Harold. "Glad to be of service any time." "Phew," remarked the inspector. "We must never let this happen again, Thomas." Wearily, Thomas agreed with him.
Trevor, the traction engine, enjoys living in the vicarage orchard on the island of Sodor. Edward, the blue engine, once helped to save him from being turned into scrap, so now Trevor lives at the vicarage and the two engines are great friends. Edward comes to see Trevor every day. Sometimes Trevor is sad because he doesn't have enough work to do. I do like to keep busy all the time, Trevor sighed one day. And I do like company, especially children's company. Cheer up, smiled Edward. The Fat Controller has work for you at his new harbour. I am to take you to meet Thomas today. Oh, exclaimed Trevor happily. A harbour, the seaside. Children, that will be lovely. Trevor's truck was coupled behind Edward, and they set off to meet Thomas. Thomas was on his way to the harbour with a trainload of metal pilings. They were needed to make the harbour wall firm and safe. Hello, Thomas, said Edward. This is Trevor, a friend of mine. He's a traction engine. Thomas eyed the newcomer doubtfully. A what engine? He asked. A traction engine, explained Trevor. I run on roads instead of rails. Can you take me to the harbour, please? The Fat Controller has a job for me. Yes, of course, replied Thomas, but he was still puzzled. Workmen coupled Trevor's truck to Thomas's train, and soon they were ready to start their journey. I'm glad the Fat Controller needs me, called Trevor. I don't have enough to do sometimes, you know. Although I can work anywhere, in orchards, on farms, in scrapyards, even at harbours. But you don't run on rails, puffed Thomas. I'm a traction engine. I don't need rails to be useful, replied Trevor. You wait and see. When they reached the harbour, they found everything in confusion. Trucks had been derailed, blocking the line, and stone slabs lay everywhere. We must get these pilings through, said Thomas's driver. They are essential. Trevor, he said, we need you to drag them round this mess. Just the sort of job I like, replied Trevor. Now you'll see, Thomas. I'll soon show you what traction engines can do. Trevor was as good as his word. First he dragged the stones clear with chains, then he towed the pilings into position. Who needs rails? He muttered cheerfully to himself. Later, Thomas brought his two coaches, Annie and Clarabelle, to visit Trevor. Thomas was most impressed. Now I understand how useful a traction engine can be, he said. Thomas's coaches were full of children, and Trevor gave them rides along the harbour. Of all the jobs he did at the harbour that day, he liked this best of all. He's very kind, said Annie. He reminds me of Thomas, added Clarabelle. Everyone was sorry when it was time for Trevor to go. Thomas pulled him to the junction. A small tear came into Trevor's eye. Thomas pretended not to see and whistled gaily to make Trevor happy. I'll come and see you if I can, Thomas promised. The vicar will look after you, and there's plenty of work for you now at the orchard, but we may need you again at the harbour someday. That would be wonderful, said Trevor happily. That evening, Trevor stood in the orchard, remembering his new friend Thomas, the harbour, and most of all, the children. Then he went happily to sleep in the shed at the bottom of the orchard.
It was a beautiful morning on the island of Sodor. Thomas the tank engine's blue paint sparkled in the sunshine as he puffed happily along the branch line with his coaches, Annie and Clarabelle.
Thomas made good time and soon arrived at the station where Toby and Percy were waiting at the platform. He was feeling very pleased with himself. "Hello, Thomas," whistled Percy. "You look splendid." "Yes, indeed," boasted Thomas. "Blue is the only proper colour for an engine." "Oh, I don't know. I like my brown paint," said Toby. "I've always been green. I wouldn't want to be any other colour either," added Percy. "Well, anyway," huffed Thomas, "blue is the only colour for a really useful engine. Everyone knows that." Percy said no more. He just grinned at Toby. They knew only too well that sometimes Thomas could be a little too cheeky for his own good. Later, Thomas was resting in a siding when Percy arrived in the yard. Percy pulled his trucks to a large hopper to load them with coal. Thomas was still being cheeky. "Careful, Percy," he warned. "Watch out with those silly trucks." Go on," muttered the trucks as Percy pulled each one under the hopper. "And by the way," Thomas went on, "those buffers don't look very safe to me." But he got no further. With a tremendous bump, the last truck passed the hopper much too fast. The coal poured down all over Thomas. "Help, I'm choking!" cried Thomas. "Get me out!" Percy was worried, but he couldn't help laughing. Thomas's smart blue paint was covered in coal dust from smoke box to bunker. "Ha ha!" chuckled Percy. "You don't look really useful now, Thomas. You look really disgraceful." "I'm not disgraceful," choked Thomas. "You did that on purpose. Get me out!" It took the men so long to clean Thomas that he wasn't in time for his next train. Toby had to take Annie and Clarabel instead. "Poor Thomas," whispered Annie and Clarabel. They were most upset. Thomas was upset too. He was very grumpy in the shed that night. Toby thought it a great joke, but Percy was cross with Thomas for thinking that he had made Thomas's paint dirty on purpose. Fancy a really useful blue engine like Thomas becoming a disgrace to the Fat Controller's Railway, said Percy. "I wouldn't have missed all that fun for anything," he chuckled. Thomas was at the platform the next day when Percy brought his trucks in from the junction. The trucks were heavy. "I feel so tired," Percy puffed as he pulled into the station. "Have a drink," said his driver. "Then you'll feel better." The water column stood at the end of the siding with the unsafe buffers. The props underneath the buffers were old and needed mending. Percy moved forward and found that he couldn't stop. The buffers didn't stop him either. "Woo!" wailed Percy. "Help!" The buffers were broken and Percy was wheel-deep in coal. It was time for Thomas to leave. He had seen everything. "Now Percy has learned his lesson too," he chuckled to himself. That night, the two engines made up their quarrel. "I didn't cause your accident on purpose, Thomas," whispered Percy. "You do know that, don't you?" "Of course," replied Thomas, "and I'm sorry I was cheeky. Your green paint looks splendid again, too." "In future, we'll both be more careful of coal," said Thomas wisely.